Hi. I'm Rachel DeWoskin. I teach fiction here at the University of Chicago. This is Nicholas Montemarano, and I don't, because I know some of you were not here last night for the stunning reading that Nicholas gave, I'm going to start by kind of reintroducing him, and then I think we can just have a conversation. I'm going to ask a question that takes where we left off last night and leads into more questions. But feel free to interrupt at any moment, ask questions, participate. This is going to be a dialogue between all of us. So I read last night an excerpt from one of Nicholas's stories in his first collection, If the Sky Falls, which is this beautiful and very compressed, dynamic book. And he writes in this, I think it's the third story from the end, which is called Story. I am writing about what happened this afternoon in the park because I want my son, just 3 years old, to remember what he saw and maybe a few things he didn't see. And then 2 pages later, his narrator confesses, I can go no further with this story. I don't know what happens next. I wrote the beginning 6 months ago, and I have been waiting to find out what happens next, and I have discovered that nothing happens next, or rather nothing will happen that involves my fictional son in the park on some fictional fall afternoon with some fictional people eating fictional sandwiches and a fictional police officer putting fictional handcuffs around a boy's wrists. And I think in that passage, Nick addresses our wonder directly in a way that he often does, also in his debut novel, A Fine Place, and in his most recent novel, The Book of Why. And last night at his reading, Nick said this thing about how he doesn't like things that smell like fiction. Was it smell or stench?
I think I was quoting Rick Moody, quoting one of his teachers who called it the stench of fiction.
The stench of fiction.
Sounds worse, I think.
So actually, you know, Philip Lopate jokes about stench of self in memoir, too. Oof. So I think truth, it turns out, can smell bad. And what I'm interested in asking or fake truth, I guess, what I want to know is how you inhabit what for me is a wild range of extremely difficult and sometimes very disturbing characters. What your literary tools are, your kind of lyrical tools, your emotional tools, and your technical tools to make your characters so authentic.
That's a lot of tools. I said this last night, but I think voice is hugely important for me. It's why I write in first person most often. Once I get the voice, once I could hear it, it's, you know, I almost feel like I'm not really writing it. And I know that sounds like I'm poo-pooing craft too much, but I think like you learn the craft, you study it, you embody it, you read a lot, and then at a certain point it becomes kind of intuitive. And then in revision, I think the craft comes back in more for me. But that first draft, that first burst, it's a lot of intuition, and it's a lot of listening to voices. And I think that's the easiest way for me to embody or inhabit a character. I think Toni Morrison said something like this, that, you know, once you get the voice, it can really take you a long way once you hear it. I think that's true for me. That's the first and most important tool is hearing it, listening to what that character sounds like. Emotionally, I mean, I don't think I do write about some difficult things, some dark things, but I feel like I don't really have a choice. I guess you always do have a choice, but I don't really feel like I do. Anything else that I were to write about that wouldn't be urgent, that's the word I would use, to me, I just would rather not write. I'd rather just do something else, you know, watch movies or something. Mm-hmm. So while I'm writing it, because I'm so, you know, really paying attention to the language and the sentences and the voice, I'm not hit so emotionally in the process of writing it. But then, like, when I put that particular story down for the day, and then I'm going about the rest of my life with my kid or my wife or whatever, I'll feel it. I'll really feel it. You know, like that I haven't let it go, and that sucks. You know, like that's really hard. That's where I feel the emotional impact. And there are some moments where I think, like, is this worth it? You know, to write about these things because it does have an effect on you, I think. But I don't feel it when I'm writing it. When I'm writing it, it's just like hear the voice, listen, write it, and you know, and that's it. Just go.
So you've written some nonfiction, and this is a conversation that my students and I have all the time here. The conversation about truth and reality and what the relationship is between the two. And I wonder what you think about the difference between using material that comes from your lived experience and using material that comes from your imagination, if there is a difference.
I'm going to quote another writer, Raymond Carver. He said a little bit of autobiography and a lot of imagination are best for him. And for me, I would say it's a combination of those two things. It's a little bit more autobiography for me and a little bit less imagination than it sounds like it was for Carver. The things that are most urgent to me that I feel like I really need to write about do have some connection to my actual life or something I'm once removed from. Those tend to be the things I care about most. Even if you may read something I write and you may say like, well, how does he care about that? Or if I'm writing something that's saying, right now I'm writing something that's set in Syria, for example, right? I've never been there. But it does have a personal connection to me on some level that I won't go into now, but it has to have some personal connection for me to feel that sense of urgency. I lost the other part of your question.
That's okay. I was talking about imagination versus experience and whether there's any difference in a craft sense and in terms of what the impact of a given story or novel is. I mean, you take a historical incident, right,
Yes.
for your first novel, and then you imagine it out to what I consider to be its furthest possible reaches, politically, emotionally, and structurally.
Yeah, so with that first novel, there is a, I don't know what you call it, a real life, actual truth counterpart to that novel, right? There was an actual event that took place that involved my family in a very large way. But I never once thought about writing it as a memoir. I always knew that I needed to invent things, imagine things, to get at something deeper. And I think that's why I just almost always turn to fiction. The few times I've written nonfiction, the only times I've written nonfiction, 3 times, I've published memoir pieces. All 3 times I was asked to do it. I didn't choose to do it. So one time, Washington Post magazine called me, said, we have this thing called fiction writers writing memoir. The only requirement is it has to be true and it has to take place during the summer. So I wrote a piece for that. Another time, Double Take magazine asked me to write something about my first novel, about what the story behind it was. I wrote that. And then somebody else recently asked me to write something, for a nonfiction anthology, and I wrote something about my dog dying. Like that's it. I've never chosen to write nonfiction. So fiction seems to me to be the best vehicle to get at truth. Interesting, though, the piece that I wrote for the Washington Post, which was, I mentioned this a little bit last night, I think I did, where I was working for Gucci. I was a college student. That was my job for summers. I was working as a security guard there, and they used racial profiling at the same time. I had my first serious girlfriend. I lost my virginity to her, a big moment in my life. She was African American. So I had these 2 things going on at the same time. That's what I wrote about. In my new collection of short stories, I included that in my collection of short stories. It's nonfiction. It was published as nonfiction, and yet I put it in a book of fiction. I don't see any problem with that. I really don't. It's a story. It's just that one happened to be 100% actual truth, whereas the other ones are some combination that nobody needs to know. Yeah.
I'm curious how you would respond to this. I have a student who's working on there's always a surreal, fantastic element in his stories, and he's been having some issues with it. And he told me, well, when I write about myself, it's easy. When I'm building these inventive worlds. Basically, he said that's just harder, and give me a break a little bit. At least I feel like that's what he was saying.
Which one did he say was harder?
When he's building an imagined world, especially a fantastic world where he has to. And I'm just curious how you would respond to that.
I would say it completely depends on the writer. It completely depends on the writer. For one writer, what's difficult is going to be easier for another writer. For one writer, a way of getting at truth is going to be through realistic fiction. For another writer, it's going to be another way. I think of the writer Kevin Brockmeyer, who I admire a lot. he writes these amazing, emotional, powerful little fables. They're like little fairy tales, and yet they don't smell like fiction to me. They're fantastical, but they smell really real, emotionally real. So for him, at some point, through writers that maybe he's read and admired, and through his own practice as a writer, he discovered, I think, that mode is his best way of reaching truth, and maybe it's more natural or easier to him. For me, that's so far not necessarily the way that's best for me. I tend to be a realist, so to speak. So I would just say to that student, or any student that would ask that, I would say just whatever works for you. It really depends on the writer. Yeah.
I have another question about the stench of fiction. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from the writer Barry Lopez. He said, the distinction is not between fiction and nonfiction. The important distinction is between an inauthentic story and an authentic story. And the difference is that in an inauthentic story, the storytelling is more important than the story itself. That the writer is placing more value on how he's telling the story than on the story itself. And I was wondering, and which is kind of the way I define, I don't talk about the stench of fiction in my classes because I teach nonfiction, but I talk about the stench of creative writing. So that's creative writing. Kill it. Because it smells like creative writing. You want that out. And I think that's sort of the defining aspect of what we're talking about when we talk about the stench of fiction. That's just that smell in the fictional half. But we have it in the stench of memoir, too,
Yeah.
where you just get this sense that the writer doesn't have to tell this story. He doesn't have to tell the story, he just has to tell a story. He or she is just spending way too much time on, usually at the surface level, it comes out as a kind of lyricism.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. What I always say to my students is style and everything else, but style has to be at the service of the story. Now, in some stories, style is a little bit more of the main event. Like when I think of Lolita, it's like it's more self-consciously stylistic. It's part of the event, but it's written that way for a reason. That fancy prose style for a murderer. It's right there. But I'm also turned off by writing that just seems to be wanting to show off. I don't mind writers who are brilliant and lyrical and talented, and you could see it if it's at the service of something that's emotionally authentic. I don't have really much time for people who want to show off, just for the sake of showing off.
I guess last night you had said, like, the definition, for me, the stench of fiction is when I get this sense that, correct me if I'm misremembering this, that the writer didn't have to tell this story,
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I mostly mean when I say the stench of fiction. When I read it and it feels, just like it doesn't feel like emotionally true and urgent, and that comes through in the writing, and it could come through the very way you just said. The writer showing off. The writer's just there to show you how smart he or she is. Like that would be, I would smell like the stench of fiction on that, I think. So maybe there's different categories that fall under that umbrella, but stench of bad writing. Yeah, when it comes down to it, there's good and bad writing, and it's subjective. And but just for me, I know my aesthetics is very much grounded in a sense of emotional reality.
Sure.
So you can say as much as you want about your own personal life, but maybe also like to each his own or her own kind of answer. But you both alluded to like a lot of the dark stuff that you've written about. It has to have some personal connection to you. So, what is when is a person ready to, like I've heard people say like, when I'm in my darkest, that's when I write my best, everything, and like I've never found that to be true. I'm just like, I just want to deal with it in a really boring way, and then like later look at it and like when I understand it. So like, where are you in that process?
I think it depends on the piece. It really does.
On the piece, not the writer necessarily? Or?
For me, it's just dependent on the piece,
Okay.
So my first novel which dealt with this racial murder that took place in Brooklyn in 1989. I wrote that in the late 90s, so like 10 or 12 years later. The reason I wrote it is because the people who were in my family who were kind of sort of involved with that were starting to get really old and dying, and so I felt this urgency to do it, but it was like a decade later. Then again, when I wrote the nonfiction piece about my dog dying, I wrote it the day after, and it would be a different piece if I didn't write it then. I had to write it then, I think it comes across. I think if you read it, you'd be like, oh man, this guy's right in the midst of this, So it depends on the piece, but I think what you've probably been told is like, oh, you gotta wait, you need some distance from it. I don't know. I think it depends on you, depends on the story. There are certainly risks of writing about something that's just so fresh, a lot of risks, I think, to doing that.
I actually find your writing very playful and kind of direct on this subject. I mean, there are moments in all of these stories and in some of the novels where all of a sudden Nick will come out and say, actually, it's me. I actually marked one that's particularly funny.
There are a lot of those.
Yeah, so at the end of the book of Why, there's a series of possible endings. We could end with her sleeping. We could end with her leaning against a man who looks like me. Some books say the past and future are illusions. The past gives you a false identity and the future promises salvation. Some books say the present moment is all there is. There's nothing other than right now. This would mean that the man who looks like me is an illusion, and so is his wife, and so is his dog running through the snow. And then a page later it says, it's me. I shouldn't keep implying it isn't when it is. I shouldn't keep saying the man who looks like me as if he isn't me, as if he doesn't live inside me, as if I wasn't there. I mean, to me, it's a direct response to this question and to the question of who's who in fiction. The writer Cheryl Strayed recently joked at this reading that when she published her memoir, everybody dug through it viciously looking for the things that weren't true. Whereas when she published her literary novel, everybody dug through it viciously looking for the parts that were true about her life. And I think we have a kind of detective desire, and I find your kind of lyrical and literary joking about that desire to be quite funny and satisfying in these books.
Yeah, I do that a lot. There's only so many times you can do it, right? Or if you do it, you have to do it in new ways.
Yeah.
So I can't keep writing story after story where the narrator comes in and says, I can go no further with the story.
Right.
I can't do that move. And yet I have a tendency to want to do a move that's like that I have to resist sometimes or sometimes go with it. And so there's that one. That's like one of the more subtle ones, because in that novel, it's a first-person narrator, but he occasionally writes about himself in the third person. He's trying to distance himself from some certain things, and that's the moment he comes in and says, wait, I gotta cut this shit out, it's me. But I don't know, I feel like I do that a lot, and it's not like a gimmick. I don't see it as a gimmick, really. I see it as just something that happens naturally when I'm writing stories. I'm the guy that gives readings, and people come up to me afterwards and say, did that happen? I'm that guy. I always get that question, did that happen? That was true, right? But you said it was true at the end of the story, right? You use your own name. I get that all the time, and that's, to me, I take that at it's not a game, I won, but it's sort of it is a compliment for somebody to say that happened, right? When your sister was abducted, no, my sister's alive and well, and I'm gonna go see her this weekend. Oh, no, but you wrote the story about where she was kidnapped and you never saw her again. No, where did I say that was true? It's fiction.
Although in the following story you say, this is actually about my real father, his name is Nick, my name is Nick, look at the cover of the book.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of, there's
there's that.
You peel back one layer and underneath it is another layer. And when you pick up a novel or a short story collection, you're agreeing to read something that's imaginary, and yet finding that it might actually be true gives you a giddy sense of urgent delight, I would say.
Yeah, Tim O'Brien was a formative influence on me as a writer. Absolutely. I went to see him speak when I was in graduate school. He didn't read any stories, he just told them. And I was absolutely riveted, I was emotionally invested, heartbroken, all the feelings you go through when you hear a great story. And at the end, if you probably heard of this, that Tim O'Brien does this, he's like, oh, now I have a confession to make. None of that was true, I made it all up. And I had never read his work at this point in time in my life, and I was just so angry. I was so like, what? How could he do that? But the more I thought about it, I was like, of course. He's like, what do you expect? I'm a fiction writer. I tell stories. If I stood up here and I just said I was drafted, I was scared, I wanted to run away to Canada, I almost did, but I didn't, would you really care? And there was just this light bulb moment for me. And the difference is that O'Brien plays with that in his books. He's just, I love his work. He's been very influential on me, and I think that's where some of that comes from. But I do say that, yeah. This is my dad. My dad's name is Nick, and he was a little off-put by that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I've had people a lot of people be off-put about things I've written. So I've lost friendships over things I've written, and I regret that because I'm really edging up against actual things, and it's been one of the biggest changes in my relationship to my writing. Is like, I used to just be like all Philip Roth about it. Like, if you want to be a writer, you have to just forget your family, forget your friends, just write it all. And for a while I did that, and then, you lose a friend here, you lose a friend there, and you're like, okay, I have to think about this a little bit more before I really come so close to.
I find that surprising because to me, the other thing that stands out about your work is a kind of an empathy with even the most bizarre behaviors your characters sometimes commit, the things they do. I mean, we read in one of my classes your story, The Usual Human Disabilities, in which a home nurse takes his cerebral palsy patients to a strip club. And it's a bad idea, forgive me. I mean, not the story, but this journey that they go on. But he means well. He's a very complicated person who makes a series of bad choices, but the story it's not a judgmental story. We talked about this a little bit last night too, and I feel like each of your creations, the self-help guru who's been disillusioned, and the brother who's lost his sister, and even the mother whose punishment, in a sense, sets off this chain of events that leads to the child's kidnapping, they're three-dimensional human beings, and to me it seems like your work is more concerned not with whether what people do is good or bad, but with the question of why people do the things we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So your friends should be more forgiving.
I think so, but I agree with that. But when it comes to, it's tough when it comes to like an actual human being who is like, hey, I see myself in that, and like, what the hell, and especially if it's a friend that you and your spouse share, and that your spouse is no longer friends with, it's like it has a ripple effect that you have to actually start being like, okay, I have to be a little bit more careful about this. Even if I, could try to say to the person, but it's not you, it's a fictional character, but look at how empathetic this character is. Like, doesn't matter, it doesn't matter to some people. So, yeah.
So, some of the real fun and one of the cool parts about Nikolai is are those structuring self-help experts. When they talk about inauthentic prose, that probably that genre would, most of us here would have a fair amount of that. But what I enjoyed is that it is not just plausible, but actually pretty convincing. But as I mentioned, you must have somehow had to strike the balance between how convincing will it be, right?
Mm-hmm.
His philosophy is, is seductive, but ultimately falls just a little short of reality.
Yes.
So I'm wondering how much time you spent getting that balance right. Did you ever want to write it in the broadest, most comically possible? Or?
No, that's exactly what I wanted to avoid. I've read a lot of self-help books, some on my own. Who was I talking to about Wayne Dyer? It was you, okay. So there's this guy Wayne Dyer. He's like the grandfather of self-help, and I came upon him on PBS. I walked into the room one day, turned on the TV, and there was this guy talking about the source of everything, and how if you just connect with that source, you can have the life you really want. And it had a very spiritual tone to it. And I just couldn't shut it off. I was just really looking at this PBS show, and I was enthralled, and started to read this guy's books. And anyway, that's what the seed for getting me into this whole notion of how does somebody come to believe this, and is there any truth to it? Then there's a book like The Secret, the mega best-selling book, The Secret. That's the kind of, I would put Wayne Dyer somewhere where I was shooting, like someone who makes some sense, has a spiritual side to it, means well, has helped people. And then I would put The Secret on this extreme of, I think, potentially laughable, potentially seen as greedy. You know, like some of the, then there are other books that are like The Secret where they have these techniques. Carry a $100 bill around in your wallet at all times, and this way you are always reminded that you're wealthy, that you always have that there, and you'll see money will start coming to you in the mail. There's like a greediness to it and a weirdness to it. If I went after that, it would have been too easy. I don't think it would have been an empathetic character. I had to go and portray Eric Newborn, the narrator, as someone who really, really meant well. And I absolutely had to go back into his childhood to try to explain, like, what happens to somebody that makes them believe this, like in this kind of tricky way of thinking about the universe, which is almost like has an OCD quality to it. Like if I don't step on that crack, things are going to be okay. And ultimately, it really comes down to control. I mean, it's a novel about control, trying to control things. So I was very conscious of that. The only moment that I really went close to that, I think, is when he goes to the self-help conference and he meets with this like self-help guru, this older woman. She is no lawyers in the room, right? Very much based on this woman, Louise Hay, who wrote a book called You Can Heal Your Life. And she breaks down every single thing that can go wrong in your body and with your health to an emotion. You know, so it could be something like, oh, you're HIV positive. Well, take a look at your anger issues. You know, just some stuff that is borderline insulting, right? So there was that one character in the book that I came the closest I've come to having a character be clearly somebody who's a little bit off. But I certainly didn't want the narrator to come across that way. Yeah. I went to see Wayne Dyer talk, you know, just to get, this is why I was writing the book, just to get even more of a sense of how somebody would present himself in that situation.
And then Nick showed up for readings, for book readings, and just read those sections so that people in the audience thought they were in the wrong room. Or,
yeah, I didn't
or
introduce it
got
at all.
help they hadn't signed up for getting.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess you said earlier that, I guess I'm trying to think about how to frame this. You said earlier that you're really voice focused, and you also said that you didn't want the narrator to be clearly one way or the other. And I'm just thinking back to the usual human disabilities. There's obviously a lot going on that the narrator either isn't taking into account. Like we have the narrator's perspective, we have Henry's perspective, and then we have what the reader is gleaning from it. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you write it from the narrator's perspective first and then kind of put in clues for the reader, or do you have the idea of what you're, not what you're trying to say, but what actually happened? Just because I think that there's so much in that story that that's contrasting between the narrator's perspective and reality.
Yeah, I think because that story is, you know, I'm going to say this about almost everything, like based on something that I know a lot about. Yeah, I used to work as a personal care attendant for a couple with cerebral palsy. You know, so like because I was drawing from things I knew, by the time I started to write that story, I kind of knew what was going to happen, you know, and all I needed to do at that point, I think, was just inhabit his voice. I knew I wanted to have a guy who was going to be kind of a little crazy, a little off, a little angry, pissed off about his job, you know, annoyed at all the things he was being asked to do something, although I didn't know what it was going to be, but do something really egregiously wrong, and yet try to have a reader sympathize with him. So if I had those things in mind, make this guy angry, make him frustrated, make him annoying, but don't throw him under the bus. Like, have something about him be understandable. And I think what I tried to do with that is, and I knew this from the beginning too, I was going to try to have Henry be just really demanding and really annoying, like, and have his friend show up and say, like, you're going to wipe my ass too. So yeah, I knew I didn't want to have Henry be like this sainted, you know, cerebral palsy, man with cerebral palsy, and I didn't want the narrator to be somebody who was just like cuckoo. You know, I knew those things going in, and that's what drove, I think, part of the voice. He's like a little delusional, but sympathetic, I hope, in some ways.
Can you say something about the end of that? So in the end of that story, our hero loses his job and then runs into Henry on the street, and Henry doesn't recognize him. And the protagonist asks Henry to tell him essentially who he is and whether he's a decent person. And it's always felt to me at the end of that story like that's the question in all these stories. Like, who is each of these characters, and is he or she someone we can forgive, or the victims of his or her bad behavior? Is it forgivable? Is it reasonable in some way?
Yeah, I think I see that as a thread running through a lot of my work. Questions of forgiveness, the idea of regretting something. The novel that I just finished, new novel that I just finished, is very much about that. It's again, no lawyers in the room, right? Are there lawyers in the room? I always call it the John Edwards novel. You know, it's I call it privately the John
He's
Edwards
a public
novel.
figure. He has no rights.
Good. That's good to hear. Nobody has, my agent or nobody said like, oh, you better have a lawyer look at this. But it's about a former senator and presidential candidate who, wins the Iowa primary and then has this sex scandal just like destroy his career and his family while his wife has cancer. We've heard this before, right? But the book it's really about like, is there something that you can do that is so egregious that is absolutely unforgivable? There's no forgiveness, no redemption, and I'm exploring that in that novel to see, like, is it possible? Because when I think in real life, I think John Edwards comes close. Like, he's somebody, I don't think he's gonna have a second act, and so I think forgiveness is a big theme, regret, somebody who's done something terrible, like how do you come back from that? The story I read last night, also has those themes in it. And those things are so linked: forgiveness, empathy, sympathy. How do you can you sympathize with John Edwards? Even if you don't know him.
Are you writing in first person?
No, it's called The Senator's Children, and it's multiple first-person narrators. His children are the narrators, and they're telling him the story of what he did. He's lost his memory, and they're telling him the story of what he did. And one of those children is the illegitimate child from the scandal. She's now 18 years old. This takes place in the 1992 election. I've like fudged with things. His name's not John Edwards. It's something else. So, yeah, forgiveness.
That's a generous concession.
Yeah.
Yeah, Boo.
So I've always been fascinated by John Edwards too, and people like him. I was having a conversation with someone, and she was telling me about 5 dinner guests who are all people she admires and she would like to learn from. And my 5 dinner guests were Mike Tyson, Bill Clinton, Steve Jobs, Kanye West, and I forgot the 5th person. And it's always because, or I would probably even put John Edwards in there. Because I might admire them to varying degrees, but I'm more fascinated by the fact that they have this bizarre mix of contradictions.
Yeah.
And I've always had this sense that like Mike Tyson, weirdly enough, I would like to be his friend. I'm just curious about the humanity behind someone who can be one thing and the exact opposite thing.
Yeah.
Simultaneously. So I was
Yeah.
just curious who your dinner guest would be.
Oh man, wow, that's a tough question. I don't know.
Interested in the same. I mean, it seems like you are with John Edwards.
Yeah, I mean, now that you mention it, and now that I've written a book that's a fictionalized version, of something related to what he did, I'm sure he'd be on that list now because I would love to, like take all the spin out of it. Like what happened? What went wrong there? And what are you doing now? I guess he would be on that list. I don't know who else would be on it. I'd probably take the easy answer and throw some writers on there like Dennis Johnson, who I just love. I don't know if my list, I would be as brave as having like a Mike Tyson on there. I think I'd be a little afraid of him, I think.
I have security.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to get back to you on that. I don't know who the 5 people would be. That's a great question, though. That's tough.
Something like with all the different types of characters you write, and especially writing in first person, how confidently, or like how well do you feel like you need to know your characters, or do you know your characters like during the process of writing
Going into it, I have to know quite a bit, but I think it's a mistake to think that you know everything about them. I think the process of writing a story has to be a process of discovering, at least partly, discovering who your characters are. For me, I do a lot of sketching, notes, maybe this, maybe that, little lines. The voice starts to become more real, and I'll do that for a period of time, and then by the time I kind of take off, I feel like I know a little bit about the voice. But I think it would be a mistake to feel like, oh, I know everything. I know how it's going to end. I know everything about this character. I think that kind of closes off possibilities. But it's very rare for me, too, to just be like, I'm just going to start with a line. I have to have some sense of prep work, even if it's just like, I guess what a visual artist would do when they're sketching before they do a painting.
Do you show your work to people close to you when you're working on it, and do you ever find that they help you to get to know your characters better?
I never show anything that when I'm in the middle of working on it. It always has to be like a draft has to be finished. Once the draft is finished, I show it to my wife, and she's a great reader because she's not a writer, and she reads a lot. She reads a lot of, a wide variety of fiction, reads literary fiction, biography, nonfiction. So she's a good reader because she's not going to be, even though she does give me line edits, she's not going to be really digging into the craft so much. She's going to give me just a reader response, and so that's the first response I get. And then depending on what kind of shape it's in, I kind of just go straight to my agent after that, and I feel like, I don't know, I've tried to be somebody who's like, I've got a writer's group or I've got a buddy. I just don't do that. I show it to my wife, and then I show it to my agent, and that's kind of all the feedback I need. And then an editor gets it after that, of course. That's kind of enough for me, like 3 or 4 people. But in the process, never, no, because I just think that's just dangerous to have somebody. I don't know. Like I think a work has to just have its vision, has to do what it's going to do, bad or good, and then see what it is.
How do you reconcile that notion with teaching workshops? He's a fabulous, thoughtful, and generous professor.
You mean what do I tell my students about that?
Yeah, I mean, how do you, when you're working on a piece that you're talking about as you work on it, or when you're looking at student work and trying to kind of help build craft as you go, how do you avoid the pitfalls?
So are you talking about like, how do I talk to them about their work that I'm seeing in progress, or my own? Like
no, their work in progress,
yeah.
and basically, how do you learn to be? I think you can learn this through the workshop. I have confidence in courses that you can learn your own kind of core set of ideas and expression, the best possible expressions of those ideas. But sometimes that learning requires hearing things that aren't helpful.
Yeah.
But I wonder how you think of it, not being someone who workshops your own work as you work on it. How do you workshop the work of others?
Well, workshops have been good to me. They've been very useful to me over my life. I just am not in a place now where I need that kind of feedback. But for them, I think it is very useful for them at this stage to get feedback for the reason you said. Like you hear things that resonate with you about your own work, things you might not notice otherwise, and then you hear things that are like, no, that doesn't resonate with me, and those are good skills to have. When students are working on longer works in my workshop, and increasingly I'm getting students who are working on novels more than short stories, never used to be the case. I try to be really encouraging about that. I don't want to, of course I'll tell students if there are red flags or things seem to be going in a wrong direction, but I simultaneously have to be very, very encouraging if somebody's working on a novel and I see that they're enthusiastic about it, there's some good qualities to it. The very reasons I wouldn't show somebody a novel in progress, like I wouldn't want to get derailed, like I don't want to do that to a student who's working on a novel.
So encouraging them to push forward, to make their pages and complete the thing.
Watch out for this, think a little bit about this, but keep going, keep going, just keep going. I always say like the success of writing a novel, the first benchmark is finishing the draft. So many people don't finish the draft, How are you going to know what you have unless you make that first lap across the pool and touch the other side? Like that's your only job, is to touch the other side of the pool. Have it be real, have a life, and then turn around and go back the other way. it kind of takes a lot of pressure off it. Just like your only job is to finish the draft at this point. Don't worry about perfection. Yeah.
How much plot do you figure out before you start writing something?
I'm trying to like come up with a percentage. I have to know. I have notes. Like the thing that I'm starting to work on now, which I think is going to be a short novel. In my bag right there is like 6 or 7 single space pages of notes, and a lot of it is maybe this happens, maybe that happens. I know the first part is going to be take place here, then the second part is going to jump back there. Maybe at the end, this is where it ends. A lot of maybes, but I have to get a lot of notes down on the page, and then I've got like the first 5 pages of it written, so I have the voice. Like the fact that I have 7 pages of single-spaced notes and I know the voice, to me, as someone who could be really neurotic sometimes about is this going to work or not, like that's almost enough for me to know that it's going to work, like that I know the voice and I have that much thought put into it. So I don't go blindly into something where I'm like, I don't know where this is going. I'm just going to start writing. I do sketch work, I guess you'd call it. But that said, when this short novel is finished, whenever that happens, I look back on those 7 pages of notes, it'll be laughable. I'll be like, oh my God, I thought I was going to do that. It'll just be, there's so many things will have changed. So it's like I have to like almost trick myself into thinking that I know what I'm doing, with the understanding that I'm going to change a lot of that plan. But I have to have some plan. Yeah.
So when I write, sometimes I tend to feel very intimidated writing about things that don't have direct personal experience with, even though I may have some kind of deeper connection with it. Do you ever struggle with that or
I tend to be afraid of that too. But the piece that I'm starting to write now is an example of something that I don't have direct experience with, but it is something that affected me personally. I'm sorry to be cryptic about it, but I don't want to talk about what it's about. But I am writing about stuff that requires research, so to speak, and I hate doing that. I hate writing about stuff that requires research. That's why I think one of the reasons I do draw from my own experiences so much. I just don't like it. I don't like having to sit down and, research something that's, I'm never going to write a 700-page epic historical novel where I have to go research the Civil War or something. Like, I'm just not going to do it. Like, I'm not interested in it. I'd rather write a short story, that's largely autobiographical. That's what I'd rather do. But I am doing something now that is a little bit more removed from my personal experience, and there's kind of something exciting about it, if that helps. It's not as scary as I thought it would be. And the reason it's not is because there is a personal connection that I have to it. So it's like that much more important for me to get it right. And so the research doesn't feel like a chore. It feels like I've got to do it because I've got this other personal reason I need to write this story. So.
This is sort of a process question as well. Do you find that you write more during certain types of times in your life?
Yeah.
And like, are there things that block you from writing, or you're like, I just don't want to write right now? Like what is that?
All sorts of things, and I think this is going to this varies from writer to writer. I almost never write at night. I write early in the morning. It's when my creativity is at its freshest. I can revise, any time of day, but as far as like literally sitting down and composing scenes and stuff, it's morning or it's not happening. Weirdly, I write really well when I'm not intending to write. When I travel, I'm on a plane. I didn't bring a notebook with me. It's like, oh, do you have a piece of paper? So it's like surprising moments. I tend to write a little bit better when I'm not teaching, like not during the semester, over sabbaticals, summers, just because you don't have so many other things, committee work and student work that are also important to you and that are in your mind. Yeah, so writing tends to surprise me sometimes, and then sometimes something will be stuck. It'll be stuck for so long, and then I'll go on a trip and it'll just like explode, you know, and I'll write it in a week. You know, it's really weird. You can't control it. It's one of the, I feel like you can't. I mean, it's one of the humbling things about writing is, to some degree, I feel like I've done everything I can do. You know, I've studied it. I read a lot. I believe what you input is very important to what you output. And so I'm reading the right things for me, you know, the writers that inspire me. But after that, all I need to do is show up on a fairly regular basis. And if it doesn't happen, it's really not my fault. It's just not meant to be that day. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Great.
If nobody else has it, I have one. So this is related to Vu's idea about internal contradictions in characters, which I think it's necessary to authenticity. And I also wonder about not answering questions. Like with the John Edwards novel, for example, you sometimes leave those single space notes, the maybe this ending in the actual book,
Yeah.
as with the Book of Why, maybe we end here, maybe we end here.
Yeah.
It seems to me that one way in which to be authentic is not to know, that it's not really the domain of fiction writers to answer questions, that's we should leave that work to the propagandists. So I wonder about that novel in particular and your work in general. How do you decide what to decide about and what just to ask?
Wow. First of all, I agree with you about that, and I do see that happening in my work on occasion, where the story itself is literally asking those things and saying maybe this, maybe that. I know in the Book of Why, I feel like that's a book that poses a lot of questions and doesn't necessarily answer all of them. And some readers, many readers, didn't like that. You know, like they were sort of like, I wanted answers. Like, was the little girl a reincarnation of his dead wife? Come on, you never tell us for sure. Or was he just kind of reading into things? Is there a logic to the universe and all these strange coincidences are happening? Is that possible? You know, or is he just kind of like reading into things? Like, people wanted me as the writer of the book, or the book, to answer that. And I was like, no, I want this book to be a book where you don't really know for sure. Yeah. Much more interesting to me. And in the John Edwards novel, Senator's Children, I'm gonna call it by its real name, it's doing something similar because it's got 3 different first-person narrators, each coming at the same series of events from different angles. You know, so there isn't one narrative. You know, there's a lot of maybes. You know, maybe this happened, maybe that happened. That is very interesting to me as a writer, for sure, and as a reader.
So an instructor here told me that basically what you just said, like ambiguity is usually good, but like whether or not the reader knows, you, the author, have to know what is actually the case. And do you agree with that?
I'm thinking of examples just from my own work. And if you ask me about the Book of Why, and some people have asked me, I've often chosen not to answer it for them, you know, but they will say, do you know if this little girl is a reincarnation of this guy's dead wife? Do you know if there is a logic to things? Do you have an opinion about this? And I will say, yes, I do. And that's it. I'll just leave it at that. So I kind of think, yeah, maybe I'd agree with that. And in the Senator's Children, I feel something similar. If somebody were to say to me, do you know what happened between these characters? I think my answer would be, yes, I do. Yeah. But does that mean that you can never have ambiguity? I don't know if I'd say that, but for me, I tend to know, I think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for showing up. Yeah.